I have lived long enough to watch elm trees grow from saplings into canopies wide enough to shade an entire county road. I have buried 2 husbands, 1 son, a collie named Breckenridge, and more friends than I can name without my voice catching somewhere around the 3rd syllable. I am 95 years old. My name is Winifred Colvane Ostreth, and I am not in the habit of telling stories I cannot vouch for with my own 2 hands pressed flat on a Bible. So when I tell you what happened to me on the 14th of February 3 years ago, Valentine's Day, of all the absurd coincidences the universe could have arranged, I need you to understand that I am not a woman who embellishes. I am not a woman who seeks attention. I have spent the better part of a century avoiding attention with the same quiet determination I used to avoid Meriwether Foss at the county potluck. And anyone who knew Meriwether would understand that avoiding him required genuine discipline. I have a condition. My cardiologist, a young man named Phineas Groft, who has the nervous habit of clicking his pen every 7 seconds, I counted once out of boredom during a long appointment, calls it a significant arrhythmia profile. What that means in plain language is that my heart occasionally forgets what it is supposed to be doing and wanders off somewhere, like a goat that has found a gap in the fence. On that February morning, it wandered farther than it ever had before. My neighbor, Dorthela Speen, a widow of 72, who still grows her own dill and has opinions about everything from soil pH to federal monetary policy, had come over to drop off a loaf of her molasses bread. She found me on the kitchen floor beside my overturned chair, the tea kettle still screaming on the burner. The paramedics who came were kind. I remember their boots. I remember the linoleum of my kitchen floor up very close, the particular pattern of it, tiny hexagons in cream and dusty green, a floor I had chosen in 1974 and never gotten around to replacing because I had come to feel that changing it would be a form of disloyalty to my late husband Rupert, who had laid it himself over the course of one humid August weekend, cursing exactly 3 times and apologizing to me after each curse with such sincerity that it had become one of the small private legends of our marriage. Then the floor was gone. I want to be careful here. I want to use the right words, and I am aware that the right words may not exist yet in the English language for what I am about to describe. The sensation was not of going somewhere. It was of arriving somewhere I had never left, as though the whole of my 92 years at that point, the fevers, the laughter, the grief, the August afternoons with a book in the yard, the winters that cracked the windowsills, had been a kind of dream, and now I was waking, not with confusion, with the most catastrophic clarity I have ever known. There was light. I will not say it was like the sun, because the sun is a small, distant, provincial thing compared to what I encountered. The light I am describing was not a phenomenon. It was a presence. It had intention. It looked at me the way a person who loves you looks at you across a room full of strangers, with absolute recognition and something close to relief, as though it had been waiting, as though my entire life had been a long walk down a hallway, and I had finally reached the door. I was not afraid. That surprised me because I have been afraid of smaller things my entire life. I was afraid of my father's silences, which could last 3 days and fill a house like cold water fills a jar. I was afraid of the summer of 1952, when my eldest boy, Rupert Jr., put a fish hook through his palm, and there was blood and screaming and a 20-mile drive on unpaved road to the nearest doctor. I was afraid of the diagnosis they gave my second husband, Clement, in the autumn of 1999, a diagnosis that turned out to be wrong, mercifully, but fear does not wait for accuracy. I had been afraid of many things, but standing in that light, I felt fear evacuate me as completely as water poured from a pitcher. There was nothing left to fill with it. And then I saw him. I am going to describe this slowly because I want to get it right, and I want you to understand that I am not using the word saw loosely. I do not mean I had an impression. I do not mean I had a feeling. I mean I saw him with the same specificity with which I am looking at the grain of my oak writing desk right now. At the water ring left by the mug I set down this morning. At the particular slant of winter light coming through the curtains, my granddaughter Persimmon, we call her Percy, helped me choose last spring. I saw him as plainly as I have ever seen anything. He was tall. His hands, and I noticed the hands particularly because I have always paid attention to hands. You can learn more about a person from their hands than from their face. His hands were the hands of someone who had done physical labor for years. There were carpenter's hands in my family. My grandfather, Absalom Colvane, built furniture by hand his entire life, and his hands looked like knotted applewood. The hands I saw reminded me of his, workman's hands, hands that knew the difference between wood grain and against it. His face was not the face from the paintings. I need to say that plainly. The face from the paintings, pale, placid, hair parted in the middle like a Victorian schoolmaster, expression of mild tolerance, bore no resemblance to what I saw. The face I saw was a Middle Eastern face, sun-darkened, with deep-set eyes of a brown so dark they were nearly black, and lines around them that came from years of squinting against desert light. A face that had been outdoors, a face that had been in arguments and at celebrations and at deathbeds, and had accumulated all of it without becoming hardened by any of it. A face that was simultaneously the most familiar thing I had ever seen and utterly unlike anything I had prepared for. He did not speak the way a person in a dream speaks, with words assembling themselves from fog. He spoke with precision. Each word landed with weight. I will tell you what he said, and I will tell you that I have repeated it to myself. every single morning since I woke up in the hospital with Dorothy Bean asleep in the chair beside my bed, and Phineas Groft standing at the foot with his pen, clicking, clicking, clicking. He spoke about leadership first. He spoke about the nature of power, not the way a professor speaks about it, as an abstraction to be analyzed, but the way someone who has watched power operate across millennia speaks about it, with a kind of sorrowful intimacy, the way you speak about a relative whose flaws you understand completely and love in spite of. He said that power has a quality like river water. It takes the shape of whatever contains it. The container matters more than what fills it. Then he mentioned Donald Trump, and I will tell you, I gasped. Not because of what he said, I will get to that, but because the specificity of it stunned me. I am a woman who has prayed her whole life, and in 95 years of prayer, I had never once expected God, or any emissary of God, to mention a specific living politician by name. It seemed too granular, too contemporary, too much like the kind of thing that happens in a sensational book that someone gives you at Christmas and you feel faintly embarrassed to be reading. But he did. He said, and I am reconstructing this as faithfully as my memory, which remains sharp in the way that old knives remain sharp, permits. He said that the man carried something that many powerful men carry, and that very few people around them can see, a wound so old it had calcified. He used the word calcified. He said the wound was not political. He said it was not ideological. He said it was the wound of a child who was taught that love was conditional on performance, and who had spent every subsequent decade performing without ever once believing the performance was sufficient. He said that such wounds, in men given great power, cast shadows that fall across millions of people who never signed up to stand in them. He was not angry when he said this. That was the part that unmade me completely. He was not indignant. He was not condemning. The expression on that sun-darkened face was the same expression I have seen on the faces of very old doctors who have watched a great deal of suffering and have come to understand that suffering is not a moral verdict. It was compassion. It was a specific kind of compassion that has no illusions left, not the soft, comfortable compassion that comes from not looking too hard, but the clear-eyed compassion that has looked at everything and chosen to remain open anyway. He said, the cruelty is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is hunger. The disease is a man standing in a mirror and seeing no one. I wept. I am not a woman who weeps easily. I wept at Rupert's funeral and at Clement's and at my son's and at very few occasions in between, because I was raised by a family that considered weeping a private matter to be conducted alone and briefly. But in that light, with those words landing one by one like stones dropped into still water, I wept without any self-consciousness at all. The weeping felt clean. It felt like the honest response to something true. He said something else then, and this is the part that I have turned over every morning with my coffee and my window and the particular quality of light that comes into my kitchen at 7 in the morning, depending on the season. He said that the argument about this man, the argument that has split families and ended friendships and filled the air of the country with a particular kind of scorched static, the argument misses the actual question. He said the actual question is not whether such a man is good or evil, because good and evil are not switches but temperatures, and human beings are not thermostats but weather systems, complicated and constantly in motion. He said the actual question, the question that history will one day have the distance to ask, is what it reveals about the people who chose him. What need was so unmet? What hunger was so profound? What story had to be told? From which part of the American soul? That this particular telling became necessary. He said, do not despise the hunger. Understand it. That is harder. That is the work. Then he said something so quiet I almost didn't catch it. He said, and pray for him. Not because he deserves it by any human accounting, but because the calcified wound is not a life sentence, and no one at any age is beyond the reach of something that can break stone. I stood there in that light, and I do not know how long, because time in that place was not the kind of time that a clock could measure. It was more like the time in a piece of music, where duration is a function of what the music is doing and not of the second hand's progress. I stood there and I felt the whole argument I had carried inside me for years. Simply, dissolve is not quite the word. Settle. The way silt settles in a jar of water when you stop shaking it. I had opinions. I still have opinions. But the opinions were quieter now, sitting in their proper place, no longer swelling up to take over the room the way they had before. Then something shifted. I felt a pull, not violent, not alarming, but insistent, the way a strong current is insistent, the way sleep is insistent when your body has decided enough is enough. I understood that I was going back. And I want to tell you something about that moment because it contained a paradox I was not prepared for. I did not want to go. I was 92 years old. My bones ached in the cold. I had buried everyone I expected to precede me, and I had accumulated enough loss to fill a root cellar, and I did not want to go back. I wanted to stay in that light the way you want to stay in a warm room when the snow is coming down outside. But there was, and this will sound strange, and I offer it only because it is what I experienced, not because I can explain it. There was something like a reason, not delivered in words, but in a knowing, the way you know something is true before you can articulate it. There were things remaining, not grand things, not heroic things, the kind of small things that seem from inside a life almost negligible, but that from that remove appeared to be precisely the point. A conversation I had not yet had with my granddaughter, Percy, who is going through something difficult and who needs to hear certain things from someone who has lived long enough to mean them. A specific kindness I owed to Dorothy Speen, who has been bringing me molasses bread for 11 years, and to whom I have never adequately expressed what it has meant to have someone knock on a door and hold out something warm and homemade with no agenda behind it. Small things, true things. I woke up with tubes and the sound of machines and Phineas Groff's pen clicking. I did not tell anyone what I had seen for 4 months. I held it like an egg I was not sure the world's temperature could support. I told Dorthela first, on a May afternoon, with her kitchen window open, and the dill she grows, looking very green and alive against the fence. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural mode of operation, but which she managed with visible effort and genuine grace. When I finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said, "Well, that sounds exactly right." And that was all she said, and it was the correct response, because it was. I am telling you now because I am 95, and I have given up the vanity of privacy regarding important things. Dorthela said I ought to. Percy, when I told her, said I ought to. Phineas Groft, who to my astonishment turned out to have strong feelings on the subject of near-death experiences. He has read extensively, apparently. He told me this while clicking his pen. Phineas said I ought to. I am not asking you to believe me. I am only asking you to sit with it for a moment, to hold it the way I held it in those first 4 months, carefully without squeezing. Because some things are not meant to be gripped. Some things are meant to be carried open-handed, the way you carry water, the way you carry light. The calcified wound, the hunger standing in the mirror, the cruelty as symptom, not disease. The small things that are precisely the point. I am 95 years old. I have a heart that forgets itself. I have a kitchen with hexagonal linoleum that my husband laid in 1974. I have a granddaughter named Percy, and a neighbor named Dorthula, and a cardiologist whose pen is louder than he knows. And I have pressed somewhere just behind my sternum, where the warmth has not faded in 3 years, the memory of a light that knew my name and was not surprised by anything it found. That is all I have to say. That is everything. If what you just heard moved you even once, hit like and subscribe. The next story is one you cannot afford to miss.